What if everything you know about Rome's mad emperor is based on propaganda from his enemies? Ancient sources from Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Philo of Alexandria describe Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior, but modern historians question whether these accounts reflect reality or political revenge. Archaeological evidence and careful analysis of primary sources reveal a far more complex story. Before diving into this historically documented investigation, if you enjoy learning about real historical figures through critical analysis of ancient sources, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these complex historical mysteries together, questioning centuries of accepted narratives through evidence-based analysis. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, has become synonymous with imperial madness, sexual depravity, and tyrannical cruelty. Popular culture portrays him as a monster who declared himself a god, committed incest with his sisters, planned to make his horse a consul, and engaged in random acts of violence against senators and citizens alike. However, when we examine the ancient sources critically, a significant problem emerges. Nearly all our detailed information about Caligula comes from writers who had reasons to portray him negatively. The senatorial historians who recorded his reign were members of the same class that assassinated him and needed to justify that assassination to posterity. Our primary sources for Caligula's reign present immediate credibility challenges. Suetonius, who provides our most detailed account in the 12 Caesars, was writing 80 years after Caligula's death and relied heavily on rumor, gossip, and second-hand accounts. Cassius Dio wrote even later, in the early 3rd century, nearly 200 years after the events he describes. The most contemporary source we have is Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who led a delegation to meet Caligula in 40 AD. His account, Embassy to Gaius, provides first-hand observations of the emperor, but is also heavily biased, as Philo was advocating for Jewish communities that Caligula had threatened. Modern historical scholarship has increasingly questioned the reliability of these sources and the traditional narrative of Caligula as simply insane. Scholars like Aloys Winterling and Anthony Barrett have argued that many of the most infamous stories about Caligula may have been invented or exaggerated by hostile sources seeking to delegitimize his rule. This doesn't mean Caligula was a good emperor or that all accusations against him are false. Rather, it suggests we need to examine the evidence more carefully, distinguishing between documented actions, plausible claims, and obvious propaganda designed to paint him as a monster. Understanding Caligula requires examining his early life and the circumstances that brought him to power. He was born in 12 AD as Gaius Julius Caesar, the third son of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, two of the most popular figures in Rome during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Germanicus was Tiberius's adopted son and designated heir, a brilliant military commander who had won major victories in Germania. His wife Agrippina was the granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, giving their children impeccable imperial bloodlines. The family was beloved by both the army and the Roman people. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, came from his childhood spent in military camps with his father's legions. Soldiers made him a miniature military uniform, including small boots, Caligio, and the affectionate nickname stuck, though he reportedly disliked it in adulthood. Suetonius records that during his early years, Caligula was known for his charm, intelligence, and rhetorical skill. Ancient sources describe him as handsome and charismatic, qualities that would serve him well in his rise to power. However, his childhood was also marked by tragedy that may have profoundly shaped his character. His father Germanicus died suddenly in 19 AD under suspicious circumstances, with many Romans believing he had been poisoned on Tiberius's orders. Whether this belief was accurate or not, it created intense political tension and established a pattern of paranoia and suspicion that would characterize imperial politics for decades. Following Germanicus's death, Agrippina the Elder became increasingly vocal in her criticism of Tiberius, believing he was responsible for her husband's death. This political opposition led to her eventual arrest and exile in 29 AD, along with Caligula's two older brothers. Both brothers and their mother would die in custody under mysterious circumstances. These family tragedies left Caligula as the sole surviving male heir of the popular Germanicus line. He survived only by avoiding politics entirely and living quietly on Capri with the aging emperor Tiberius. Ancient sources suggest he learned to conceal his true feelings and opinions, developing survival skills that would later manifest as either political genius or dangerous duplicity, depending on which historian you believe. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, the 24-year-old Caligula became emperor with overwhelming popular support. Suetonius records that his accession was celebrated throughout the empire, with Rome experiencing what he calls the happiest days in the history of the world. Over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in thanksgiving for his elevation to power. The early months of Caligula's reign provide crucial context for understanding his later behavior and the debate over whether he was genuinely insane or politically calculating. Ancient sources, even hostile ones, acknowledge that Caligula began his rule with policies that were popular and seemingly reasonable. Suetonius records that Caligula's first acts as emperor included granting bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and urban cohorts, recalling political exiles, reducing taxes, and providing generous gladiatorial games and theatrical performances. He publicly burned documents related to his mother and brother's trials, symbolically ending the climate of suspicion that had characterized Tiberius's later years. He also demonstrated political skill by honoring the Senate and appearing to restore some of the constitutional forms that Tiberius had increasingly ignored. Contemporary sources describe him delivering eloquent speeches in the Senate and consulting with senators on important decisions, behavior that contrasted favorably with his predecessor's isolation on Capri. Archaeological evidence from this period supports the image of an active and engaged emperor. Caligula initiated several major building projects, including work on temples, aqueducts, and the imperial palace. Coins from early in his reign show traditional imperial imagery and suggest he was following conventional patterns of imperial representation. However, in October 37 AD, just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. Ancient sources describe this illness as nearly fatal, with the entire empire anxiously awaiting news of the emperor's health. When he recovered, something had changed. The nature of this illness has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. Some ancient sources suggested poisoning, while others described it as a fever or brain disease. Modern medical historians have proposed various diagnoses, including encephalitis, temporal lobe epilepsy, or severe stress-related illness. Whatever the medical cause, ancient historians mark this illness as the turning point in Caligula's reign. Suetonius writes that he was insane after his recovery, while Philo suggests the illness damaged his mental faculties. However, these interpretations may reflect later attempts to explain Caligula's increasing conflict with the Senate and his abandonment of the conciliatory approach that had characterized his first months. The deteriorating relationship between Caligula and the Roman Senate is central to understanding both his historical reputation and the debate over his mental state. Ancient sources portray this conflict as evidence of his insanity, but modern scholars have increasingly interpreted it as political strategy designed to assert imperial authority over an institution that claimed to share power with the emperor. The constitutional position of the emperor in the early Roman Empire was deliberately ambiguous. Augustus, the first emperor, had carefully maintained the fiction that he was merely first among equals in a restored republic. This pretense required constant negotiation between imperial and senatorial authority, with both sides claiming constitutional legitimacy. Tiberius had largely respected senatorial prerogatives, at least formally, which made his reign acceptable to the aristocratic class, despite his personal unpopularity. Caligula, after his initial period of cooperation, appears to have decided to abandon this pretense and assert the reality of imperial supremacy. Suetonius records numerous incidents that illustrate this conflict. Caligula reportedly humiliated senators by making them run alongside his chariot for miles, forced elderly senators to participate in gladiatorial training, and publicly mocked senatorial dignity during official proceedings. These actions are typically presented as evidence of sadistic cruelty or insanity. However, modern historians like Aloys Winterling have argued that many of these incidents can be understood as deliberate political theater designed to demonstrate that senatorial status and dignity existed only at the emperor's pleasure. By forcing senators to perform humiliating acts, Caligula was making explicit the power relationship that Augustus and Tiberius had carefully concealed. The famous story about Caligula planning to make his horse Incitatus a consul provides an illuminating example of this interpretive challenge. Ancient sources present this as evidence of insanity. The mad emperor couldn't distinguish between animals and humans, or valued his horse more than Rome's most distinguished citizens. But as historian Anthony Barrett points out, we must examine what actually happened versus what was later claimed. Ancient sources agree that Caligula lavished attention and resources on his favorite horse, building it an elaborate stable and providing it with servants. Some sources claim he intended to make it a consul, others say he merely joked about it. If we interpret this as political satire rather than insanity, the meaning changes entirely. By suggesting that his horse could perform the role of consul as well as any senator, Caligula was making a devastating comment on the Senate's actual power and relevance. It was a calculated insult designed to humiliate the senatorial class, not evidence of an inability to distinguish humans from animals. Similarly, many of Caligula's apparently insane pronouncements may have been sarcastic or satirical comments that his enemies later presented as serious statements. Ancient Roman culture valued verbal wit and wordplay, and emperors were known for making provocative statements that were not intended literally. One of the most famous accusations against Caligula is that he declared himself a living god, built temples to himself, and demanded divine honors inappropriate for a Roman emperor. This claim has been central to his reputation as insane, but the historical reality is more nuanced than later accounts suggest. The worship of living emperors was a complex issue in the early Roman Empire. In the eastern provinces, ruler worship had been common for centuries under Hellenistic kingdoms, and emperors were routinely honored as gods in these regions. Augustus had accepted such honors in the East, while carefully avoiding divine claims in Rome itself. The distinction between Eastern and Western practices created ambiguity that later emperors navigated differently. Tiberius had firmly rejected divine honors anywhere in the empire, while Caligula appears to have experimented with breaking down this distinction and accepting divine worship in Rome itself. Philo of Alexandria provides our most detailed contemporary account of Caligula's divine pretensions. During his embassy to Rome in 40 AD, Philo witnessed Caligula referring to himself as a god and demanding that statues of him be placed in all temples, including Jewish synagogues. Philo's account describes this as evidence of madness and impiety. However, we must consider Philo's perspective and motivations. He was advocating for Jewish communities that had refused to place imperial statues in their synagogues, an act of religious resistance that Caligula viewed as political rebellion. Philo needed to portray Caligula as insane to excuse this defiance and protect his community from retaliation. Archaeological evidence provides some support for Caligula's religious innovations, but doesn't definitively prove megalomania. Excavations have revealed temple modifications from his reign and coins showing him with divine attributes. However, similar evidence exists for other emperors who are not accused of insanity. Suetonius describes Caligula building a temple to himself, creating a priesthood for his worship, and replacing the heads on statues of gods with his own image. These actions certainly violated Roman religious norms, but they may have represented deliberate policy innovation rather than mental illness. Some scholars argue that Caligula was attempting to accelerate the evolution of imperial ideology toward the explicit monarchical system that would eventually characterize the later empire. From this perspective, his divine claims were politically calculated, not symptoms of insanity, even if they were premature and unpopular with the senatorial class. It's also worth noting that ancient sources describe Caligula displaying what we might call religious syncretism, identifying himself with various gods, including Jupiter, Apollo, and even female deities like Diana. This eclectic approach suggests possible political or theological sophistication rather than simple egotism. Perhaps no aspect of Caligula's reputation has been more sensationalized than the sexual accusations made by ancient historians. These allegations of incest, sexual violence, and perverse behavior have become central to his image as a moral monster, but they require careful examination of sources and historical context. Suetonius's account is particularly lurid, describing Caligula as committing incest with all three of his sisters, prostituting them to other men, forcing aristocratic women into sexual slavery, and engaging in homosexual relationships that violated Roman sexual norms. These accusations have been repeated in modern popular culture and accepted as historical fact by many general audiences. However, when we examine these claims critically, significant problems emerge. First, many of these stories appear in sections of ancient texts devoted to cataloging an emperor's vices, where historians followed literary conventions that may have prioritized moral condemnation over factual accuracy. Second, accusations of sexual depravity were standard elements of Roman political invective. When Romans wanted to discredit an opponent, they routinely accused them of sexual perversion, regardless of evidence. The specific allegation of incest with sisters was a particularly common way to characterize tyrants, appearing in accounts of various rulers. The case of Caligula's relationship with his sister Drusilla is instructive. Ancient sources agree that he was deeply devoted to her, and that her death in 38 AD affected him profoundly. Suetonius claims this devotion was incestuous, while other sources describe it as unusual but potentially innocent affection. When Drusilla died, Caligula declared a period of public mourning, deified her, and established a cult in her honor. This response was unusual, but not unprecedented. Roman emperors had previously deified deceased family members. The interpretation of this behavior as evidence of incestuous relationship versus genuine grief for a beloved sister depends largely on the bias of the source and reader. Modern historians like Anthony Barrett have argued that many sexual allegations against Caligula were invented by his enemies to justify his assassination and subsequent damnatio memoria, official condemnation of his memory. Creating a narrative of sexual monstrosity helped legitimize the conspiracy against him and prevent any popular backlash. It's also worth noting that some allegations are internally inconsistent or contradict each other in ways that suggest fabrication. The accumulation of every possible sexual vice, incest, adultery, homosexuality, prostitution, sexual violence, reads more like a catalog of Roman sexual anxieties than a realistic account of one person's behavior. This is not to say that Caligula was necessarily sexually conventional or that all allegations are false. Roman emperors had enormous power that could facilitate sexual exploitation, and Caligula may well have abused this power. However, separating documented behavior from political slander is nearly impossible given our sources. Caligula's financial management provides a case study in how political enemies can transform reasonable policy decisions into evidence of insanity through biased reporting. Ancient sources accuse him of bankrupting the treasury through wasteful spending and then resorting to increasingly desperate measures to raise funds. Suetonius describes Caligula inheriting the substantial treasury that Tiberius had accumulated through careful management, then quickly depleting it through generous bonuses, extravagant games, and ambitious building projects. According to this narrative, financial crisis forced him to confiscate property, impose arbitrary taxes, and engage in behavior that was both economically irrational and morally corrupt. However, when we examine the economic evidence more carefully, a different picture emerges. Archaeological and numismatic evidence suggests that Caligula's financial policies, while aggressive, were not simply the products of a mad spendthrift. The bonuses and games at the beginning of his reign were politically necessary to secure support from the army, Praetorian Guard, and Roman people. These were standard practices for new emperors, not evidence of financial irresponsibility. Augustus and other emperors had done the same. Caligula's building projects, including work on aqueducts, harbors, and temples, represented significant infrastructure investment that would benefit the empire long term. The Aqua Claudia aqueduct, begun under Caligula and completed under Claudius, was one of Rome's most important public works. The financial problems that emerged later in his reign may have resulted from these initial expenditures, combined with broader economic factors beyond his control. Ancient sources also record that Caligula resumed expansion of the empire after Tiberius's conservative retrenchment, which would have required significant military spending. When financial pressures mounted, Caligula's revenue-raising measures became increasingly controversial. Ancient sources describe him confiscating property from wealthy citizens, imposing new taxes, and auctioning imperial possessions. These actions are presented as evidence of greed and insanity, but similar measures had been taken by previous emperors during financial crises without being characterized as insane. The difference was that Caligula's victims included senators and their class allies, who were in position to record their outrage for posterity. One famous incident involves Caligula allegedly prostituting senators' wives to raise money. This story appears in our sources as evidence of both sexual depravity and financial desperation. However, the incident may have been a forced auction of senators' property conducted in humiliating ways as political punishment, later exaggerated into sexual slavery. Modern economic historians have noted that some of Caligula's financial innovations were actually quite sophisticated. His reforms of provincial taxation and monetary policy show understanding of economic principles, not the random chaos that would characterize someone genuinely mentally ill. Caligula's military campaigns, particularly his expedition to the English Channel in 39 to 40 AD, have been portrayed by ancient sources as the ultimate evidence of his insanity. The famous story of his soldiers collecting seashells on the beach has become iconic of his supposed madness. According to Suetonius, Caligula led a massive army to the coast of Gaul, prepared as if for a major invasion of Britain, but then ordered his soldiers to collect seashells, which he declared spoils of war, and brought back to Rome for his triumph. This incident is typically presented as obviously insane behavior that proves Caligula had lost touch with reality. However, recent scholarly work by historians, including Anthony Barrett, has reconsidered this episode and suggested alternative explanations. First, we must note that only hostile sources describe the seashell incident, and their accounts differ in crucial details. Some ancient sources suggest that what actually happened was a military expedition that accomplished its objectives without requiring a full-scale invasion. Caligula may have conducted raids across the Channel, extracted tribute from British tribes, and established Rome's military presence in a region that would later be conquered under Claudius. The seashells may have been a mistranslation or deliberate misrepresentation of the Latin word musculi, which could mean either seashells or a type of siege equipment. If Caligula's soldiers were actually collecting or demonstrating siege equipment, the entire incident takes on a different meaning. Alternatively, the seashell collection may have been a calculated insult directed at the Senate, which had refused to fund the British expedition adequately. By mockingly collecting seashells and declaring them spoils of war, Caligula may have been satirizing the Senate's military incompetence and their interference with his military planning. It's also worth noting that Britain was not conquered until several years later under Claudius, despite multiple attempts. The difficulties of amphibious operations across the Channel were real, and Caligula's decision not to attempt invasion may have been prudent rather than insane. Other military activities during Caligula's reign show more conventional strategic thinking. He conducted operations in Germania, strengthened Rhine frontier defenses, and maintained the complex diplomatic relationships with client kingdoms that were crucial for managing Rome's eastern borders. Ancient sources also describe Caligula's personal military style as unconventional. He allegedly wore theatrical armor and dressed as various gods while on campaign. These behaviors are presented as evidence of delusional thinking, but they may have been calculated theatrical performances designed to impress soldiers and local populations. On January 24, 41 AD, after less than 4 years on the throne, Caligula was assassinated by members of his Praetorian Guard in a conspiracy that included multiple senators. The assassination and its aftermath provide crucial context for understanding how Caligula's historical reputation was constructed. The immediate conspiracy was led by Cassius Dio, a Praetorian tribune whom ancient sources describe as having personal grievances against Caligula. Suetonius records that Caligula had repeatedly humiliated Dio by questioning his masculinity and giving him degrading passwords to command the guard. However, the conspiracy extended beyond Dio's personal motivations to include senators who saw Caligula as a threat to their class privileges and possibly their lives. Ancient sources describe increasing tension in the final months of Caligula's reign, with the emperor making threats against senators and conducting what some historians interpret as purges of potential opponents. The assassination itself was brutal. Dio and his fellow conspirators attacked Caligula in a tunnel beneath the palace, stabbing him repeatedly. They also killed his wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, eliminating any potential heirs who might avenge him or serve as rallying points for his supporters. The conspiracy's success depended on immediate control of the narrative. The assassins needed to justify their actions to the army, the Praetorian Guard, and the Roman people, all of whom had initially supported Caligula enthusiastically. This required constructing a narrative that portrayed Caligula as so monstrous that killing him was not just justified but necessary. This is where the historical problem becomes acute. Nearly all our detailed sources for Caligula's reign were written after his assassination by authors who were aligned with or sympathetic to the senatorial class that killed him. These sources had strong motivations to portray Caligula as a monster whose death was unavoidable. Suetonius, writing 80 years later, drew heavily on scandal, gossip, and stories that emphasized Caligula's sexual depravity, religious impiety, and random cruelty. These accounts served the political purpose of justifying the assassination and subsequent elevation of Claudius to emperor. The Senate's official damnatio memoriae, the systematic effort to erase Caligula from official memory, further shaped his historical reputation. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were defaced, and documents were altered to remove references to him. This official condemnation created a climate where any negative story about Caligula would be accepted without skepticism. It's worth noting that the assassination did not result in restored republican government, which some conspirators may have hoped for. Instead, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Claudius emperor, continuing the imperial system while eliminating the specific emperor who had challenged senatorial prerogatives so aggressively. Modern medical historians have attempted to diagnose Caligula retrospectively based on ancient descriptions of his behavior, though such efforts are inherently speculative. These medical interpretations offer alternatives to both the ancient claim of simple madness and the modern political interpretation of calculated strategy. The illness Caligula suffered in October 37 AD, 6 months into his reign, is particularly significant because ancient sources mark it as the turning point after which his behavior changed dramatically. The nature of this illness has been the subject of considerable medical speculation. One hypothesis suggests that Caligula may have suffered from encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain that can result from various infections. Encephalitis can cause personality changes, emotional instability, and impaired judgment, symptoms that could explain some of the behaviors attributed to Caligula without requiring us to believe all the more extreme accusations. Another medical theory proposes temporal lobe epilepsy as an explanation for Caligula's behavior. This condition can cause changes in personality, religious preoccupation, hypergraphia, excessive writing, and aggressive behavior. Some symptoms described in ancient sources, such as sudden mood changes and possible hallucinations, are consistent with this diagnosis. However, these medical hypotheses face significant methodological problems. We are attempting to diagnose someone who died nearly 2,000 years ago, based on accounts written by hostile sources who had no medical training and were more interested in moral condemnation than accurate symptom description. Additionally, the medical interpretation may itself be a form of exoneration that prevents us from considering the political dimensions of Caligula's actions. If we attribute all his controversial behavior to mental illness, we may overlook the strategic calculations and political conflicts that better explain many incidents. Dr. Harbor Hodder, a psychiatrist who has studied historical figures, points out that the evidence for Caligula's insanity is actually quite weak if we apply modern diagnostic criteria. Many behaviors attributed to him are either unverifiable, explicable as political strategy, or consistent with the normal, if unpleasant, behavior of absolute rulers. It's also worth noting that our sources describe Caligula as capable of complex planning, strategic thinking, and effective communication, abilities that would be significantly impaired in someone suffering from severe mental illness. His ability to maintain power for nearly 4 years and conduct normal government business suggests he was not constantly deranged. The most balanced assessment may be that Caligula's behavior, whether affected by illness or not, was primarily shaped by the unique pressures and possibilities of absolute power. His actions may have become increasingly extreme, not because he was insane, but because he correctly understood that as emperor he could do almost anything without immediate consequences. Archaeological and material evidence from Caligula's reign provides important counterbalance to the literary source's emphasis on scandal and madness. These physical remains suggest an emperor who was actively engaged in governance, infrastructure development, and imperial self-presentation. Excavations at various sites associated with Caligula have revealed substantial building activity during his brief reign. The most famous is his extension of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, which included the construction of a temple to himself and architectural innovations that later emperors would continue. Recent underwater archaeology in the Bay of Naples has explored the remains of Caligula's famous pleasure barges on Lake Nemi. While ancient sources describe these ships as evidence of wasteful extravagance, archaeological investigation revealed that they incorporated sophisticated engineering, including heated floors, running water, and advanced construction techniques that demonstrated considerable technical knowledge. Numismatic evidence, ancient coins from Caligula's reign, shows both conventional and innovative approaches to imperial imagery. Early coins follow traditional patterns established by Augustus and Tiberius, while later issues show Caligula experimenting with new iconography, including the first regular use of the emperor's living image on Roman coinage. These coins were not just symbolic, they were the primary means of communicating imperial messages throughout the empire. The evolution of Caligula's coinage suggests someone engaged in sophisticated political communication, not random madness. Infrastructure projects initiated under Caligula, including aqueducts, harbors, and road improvements, demonstrate long-term planning and understanding of the empire's administrative needs. The Aqua Claudia aqueduct, though completed by his successor, was one of Rome's most important engineering achievements. Inscriptions from provinces under Caligula's rule show normal administrative activity continuing throughout his reign. Provincial governors were appointed, legal cases were adjudicated, and imperial cult activities were organized, all suggesting that however controversial his behavior in Rome, the machinery of imperial government continued to function. Archaeological evidence from religious sites is particularly interesting given accusations about Caligula's impiety. While some temples do show modifications that may reflect his religious innovations, the overall pattern suggests evolution of imperial cult practice, rather than wholesale religious revolution driven by megalomania. A critical examination of our sources for Caligula's reign reveals systematic patterns that suggest coordinated character assassination rather than objective historical recording. Understanding these patterns is crucial for attempting to reconstruct what actually happened versus what later writers wanted people to believe. Suetonius's biography of Caligula in the 12 Caesars is our most detailed source, but also the most problematic. The text is organized thematically rather than chronologically, with separate sections devoted to Caligula's virtues, vices, and death. This organizational structure itself reveals the biographical conventions of the time, which prioritized moral evaluation over historical accuracy. The vices section of Suetonius's biography reads like a catalog of every possible transgression, sexual perversion, religious impiety, financial corruption, arbitrary cruelty, and various forms of excess. The sheer accumulation of accusations strains credibility and suggests that Suetonius was more interested in creating a comprehensive portrait of evil than in carefully evaluating evidence. Cassius Dio's later account draws heavily on Suetonius and other sources, but adds additional details that reflect the concerns of his own time period, early 3rd century AD, rather than providing independent contemporary evidence. His account emphasizes themes relevant to his own era's political debates about imperial power. Philo of Alexandria's contemporary account provides our only first-hand observation of Caligula, but it too must be read critically. Philo was an advocate for Jewish communities threatened by Caligula's policies, not a disinterested observer. His portrayal of Caligula as insane served his rhetorical purposes of excusing Jewish resistance to imperial cult practices. Several patterns in the ancient sources suggest coordination or at least shared assumptions about how to portray Caligula. Accusations of incest, for example, appear in multiple sources but may originate from a single tradition rather than representing independent evidence. The timeline of accusations is also revealing. The most extreme stories about Caligula's behavior, the horse consul, the seashells, the bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples, appear in later sources and become more elaborate with each retelling, suggesting legendary accretion rather than historical memory. Modern historians applying source criticism have noted that many incidents are described using stock literary motifs used to characterize tyrants generally. The specific details attributed to Caligula often parallel stories told about Greek tyrants or earlier Roman figures, suggesting that authors were following literary conventions rather than recording unique events. If we set aside the most extreme accusations and focus on documentable facts and plausible interpretations, an alternative picture of Caligula emerges minus. Not a mad emperor, but a young, inexperienced, and ultimately unsuccessful autocrat who challenged senatorial power more directly than the aristocracy could tolerate. Caligula came to power at 24 years old, with no experience in military command or civil administration. His entire adult life had been spent surviving in Tiberius's court by concealing his thoughts and avoiding political involvement. Suddenly elevated to supreme power, he may have lacked the political judgment to navigate Rome's complex power structures effectively. His initial period of cooperation with the Senate suggests someone who understood, at least initially, the need to maintain constitutional fictions. The subsequent breakdown of this cooperation may reflect either deliberate policy choice, as modern revisionists suggest, or simply poor political judgment combined with growing frustration with senatorial obstruction. Many of Caligula's controversial actions can be understood as attempts to clarify and consolidate imperial authority in ways that earlier emperors had avoided. His religious innovations, his treatment of senators, and his financial policies all pushed toward a more explicitly autocratic system that would eventually characterize the later empire. From this perspective, Caligula was not insane, but premature, attempting to establish openly what Augustus had carefully concealed and what later emperors would achieve gradually. His failure lay not in madness, but in moving too quickly and too overtly against entrenched interests that had the power to destroy him. The aristocratic conspiracy that killed him succeeded not just in ending his life, but in shaping his historical reputation so thoroughly that separating fact from propaganda remains nearly impossible 2 millennia later. This itself was a form of political genius. The conspirators ensured their actions would be remembered as justified tyrannicide rather than aristocratic self-interest. Whether this alternative interpretation is more accurate than traditional accounts remains debated among historians. The truth likely lies somewhere between the monster of ancient sources and the misunderstood political innovator of modern revisionism. After examining ancient sources, archaeological evidence, and modern scholarship, we are left with an uncomfortable conclusion. We cannot know with certainty whether Caligula was genuinely insane, whether he was a calculated political actor whose strategies backfired, or whether the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. What we can say with confidence is that the traditional narrative of Caligula as a straightforward case of imperial madness is far too simple. The sources for his reign were written by his political enemies or those who drew on hostile traditions. The most extreme accusations against him follow literary patterns of tyrant characterization rather than showing the specificity we would expect from genuine historical memory. At the same time, Caligula clearly engaged in behavior that violated Roman norms and generated sufficient opposition to result in his assassination after less than 4 years. Even allowing for exaggeration and fabrication, something about his rule was so threatening to powerful interests that they felt compelled to kill him and then systematically destroy his historical reputation. Modern scholarship has revealed the extent to which our picture of Caligula has been shaped by propaganda, but it has not definitively replaced that picture with a more accurate alternative. We can identify which stories are likely false or exaggerated, but constructing a positive account of what actually happened remains challenging given the nature of our sources. The case of Caligula ultimately reminds us of the importance of source criticism in historical studies. Popular culture continues to treat ancient accounts as straightforward fact, while scholarly work increasingly recognizes the complex motivations behind their creation. This gap between popular perception and academic understanding is unlikely to close, as the monster narrative is simply more compelling than the nuanced historical reality. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that Caligula remains enigmatic, a young emperor whose brief reign was catastrophic for him personally, but whose actual character and motivations remain obscured by nearly 2 millennia of hostile reporting. He serves as a reminder that history is written by survivors, and that political power extends beyond death to shape how past events are remembered. Whether Caligula was mad, bad, or simply dangerously misunderstood, his reign provides important lessons about the nature of absolute power, the reliability of historical sources, and the ways political narratives are constructed and maintained. The fact that we still cannot resolve these questions with certainty tells us as much about the limitations of historical knowledge as it does about Caligula himself.